Hello there and welcome. I hope you had a nice week. Today we are building a second empire house, and this building is part of my series Tiny History. If you're new here, in this series I recreate houses of the most popular architecture styles and tell you something about its history. But today's episode has a little twist in it. Because today we will talk less about the architecture and instead we will talk about haunted houses in different media. The architectural style of the Second Empire and the haunted house are tied together very closely. And this, for one, is strongly embossed by the media. When we think about haunted houses, we have pictures in our mind of the home in Psycho, or the Addams Family house, or the Phantom Manor in Disneyland. These houses are all examples of the Second Empire. As I already said, I don't want to talk too much about the architecture, because it is pretty similar to the Gothic Revival and Queen Anne, which I already covered, but I want to throw in some quick facts about it. So, the Second Empire architectural style originated in France in 1852. It exhibits elements of different historical styles like the Gothic and the Renaissance. It came to North America around the year 1865, where it was one of the most popular architectural styles until 1900. Here, the style was especially used for townhouses. Like the architecture in the Gothic Revival and Queen Anne, this style is a very highly decorated style, and the layout could be symmetrical or asymmetrical. The biggest difference, though, is the mansard roofing, which makes it easily distinguishable from other architectural styles. So, why is it that this type of architecture comes to our minds when we talk about haunted houses? For this, we have to take a step back and have a look at the history of the haunted house genre. The first recorded record we have comes from Pliny the Younger, who lived in the 1st century and who wrote a letter to his patron Lucius Sura, in which he describes a haunted villa in Athens. You can also find stories about haunted houses in Middle Eastern, for example in 1001 Night, which was written around the 9th and the 13th century. In Europe, the haunted house gets its comeback in 1764. And this year, the first Gothic novel, Castle of Otranto, was published. The author was Horace Walpole. Like the title says, the story is not a haunted house story, but rather a haunted castle story. And this is actually a quite important part of the history of the haunted house genre. The literal scientist Manuel Aguirre formed the term of the so-called closed space. And this term describes a device which was used by the authors back then to make a space stand out in a specific way. And for this, a castle is very well suited because its architecture is very different from regular homes. What is also important for the closed space is that the location is a special one, and in the early Gothic novels, which came from England, for example, the castles were located in, let's say, exotic countries. And what I mean with the term exotic is that they were mostly located, for example, in Italia or Spain, because the climate of these countries and the culture of these countries were so much different from the ones in England. And this not only marked the haunted castles as a special place, it took also the fear away from the reader. And back then, the authors and the readers believed that when you're too afraid of a story, then you're not able to understand the moral behind the story. So it was important to take a bit of the fear away from the reader, and that's why the haunted castles were often or actually always located in faraway countries. This novel, The Castle of Otranto, which again was published in 1764, was the starting point for many authors to write haunted house stories. For example, we have Anne Radcliffe, who, funnily enough, was born in the year 1764, in which the first Gothic novel was published. Anne Radcliffe's novel The Mysteries of Udolpho was published in the year 1794, and it is regarded as the high point of the Gothic novel. Interestingly, it's also a variation of the haunted castle genre. She introduces the so-called explained supernatural into the haunted castle, which was highly dominated by stories about the supernatural. The term explained supernatural means that incidents that are firstly viewed as a supernatural happening are later explained as the doing of humans. And allow me the short note here, but isn't it very interesting that it's a woman in the 18th century who introduces logical reasoning into popular novels? Another important changing point in the history of the haunted castle, or respectively haunted house genre, is Edgar Allan Poe. His novel The Fall of the House of Usher was published in the year 1839. This story is regarded as the first modern example of the haunted house genre. It is the first story in which the haunted building is located in a more urban space. And what is also important is that the House of Usher is not located in a faraway country anymore. It is located in the USA. And this closes the distance between the horror and the reader. So, The Fall of the House of Usher was the starting point of the modern haunted house genre, and after this story, the genre boomed. And this brings me back to the start of this video and the question why the Second Empire architecture is so often used to picture haunted houses in media. And that's because the modern house story originated in the USA and was very popular there in the late 19th century. And to that time, the Second Empire was popular as well. The people who illustrated the stories couldn't draw inspiration from history because the haunted house as a house didn't exist before, or maybe rather wasn't present for them. And also, the plots of the stories were happening in their present time, so it was only logical to use the dominating architectural style of their time. And this picture of the haunted Second Empire house was carried to our present, where it's still used, even though not exclusively anymore. So we're not at the end of the video yet, and I want to start the second part of this video as I started the first one and ask a question. And this time the question is, why is it that the haunted house genre is so popular? And here I'm talking a bit out of my own perspective, and if you are not new here, you maybe watched an earlier video of mine in which I told you that I wrote my master thesis about the topic of the haunted house in the oeuvre of an German artist. And while I was researching about the haunted house genre, there were things that I realized that I didn't know before, and that's what I want to share with you, my observations. And there are mainly two reasons for the popularity of the haunted house genre. And what's interesting is that this genre is so old. Like I told before, the first report of a haunted house is the letter from Pilus the Younger in the first century. And so this genre actually is at least 2000 years old. And the first reason for the popularity of the genre brings us actually back again to history and to psychology. And The important thing about a house is that it's a very important space in our lives. It's a space where we want to feel safe, which is a refugee, which is our very own space, which we decorate the way we want to, and it's a very personal space and a space that is important for our security. And in the moment where the house is not a secure space anymore, we actually have to question ourselves, where are we safe when not in our own home? The appeal of the horror genre is to feel scared, and obviously the haunted house hits home in this aspect. And yes, the pun is intended. I'm sorry for that. Looking back at our history as humans, finding a home and having one as a space where we can feel safe from weather, wild animals, or foes was an important thing, even when the house was only a cave. Another reason for the popularity is that the haunted house genre is so adaptable. It adapts to the time, like changing the setting from a castle to a house. And nowadays, even apartments can be haunted. But it also adapts to its viewers. The cause of the haunting can have a supernatural cause, for example. The Amityville horror movies would be a very good example for this, I guess. The movies were very popular and are still very popular, I think, until this day. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between a ghost story and a haunted house movie, and I don't think this is really necessary because the haunted house genre not necessarily is a genre. You can view it either way. It's sometimes only important that the location is a haunted space. And sometimes the house is not really haunted, even, and it's an evil entity itself, like, for example, in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. And while we are at this specific novel, it's very interesting that the haunted house has a lot of different shades of horror. Like we have the paranormal, the obvious horror, which comes from um, obvious danger, like ghosts or intruders. But there are also examples for a psychological horror in novels and movies in which you don't know if that what you see or read is really happening in the plot or it's only the cause of maybe a mental illness of the protagonist. And this not only happens in Shirley Jackson's novel, but also in The Fall of the House of Usher. It is very difficult to tell if this what's happening is real or is only in the mind of the protagonist. But if the paranormal doesn't scare you, there are also many examples in literature and movies in which the haunting is caused by intruders. And the haunted house genre is even suitable for children. One of the titles of the book series Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators is, for example, The Secret of Terror Castle. Or to name a newer example for this, there is the movie for children Monster House from 2006, and you can also find adaptation of the haunted house in popular series. There are some episodes for this, for example in the X-Files and in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So I could tell you much more about the genre, but we're at the end of the video. I think I will do this kind of video again, but probably not until Halloween. If you enjoyed this type of content, please like, subscribe and leave me a comment. You can also follow me on Instagram and Pinterest. I put the links in the description box down below. And of course you can find this build on the gallery. My ID is marygrave. I wish you a lovely weekend and hope to see you next week, so bye bye!